they had already kidnapped a senior Army officer. So I had a bodyguard that was with me all day and at night.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app or join our emailing list to keep up with the latest episode. We continue the story of Richard Stachurski from the previous episode. In 1971, Richard left NASA and was assigned to the Drone Remotely Piloted Vehicle System Program Office at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. From 1975 to 1978, Richard did a tour of duty with the air staff at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and between 1978 and 1981, he was Deputy Program Manager for the Ground-Launched Cruise Missile Program, GLCM, or GLCM, System Program Office, engaged in the adaptation of the Navy's cruise missile for use by the Air Force. In 1981, he was assigned to the staff at US Air Force Europe Headquarters at Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany, responsible for the deployment of the ground-launched cruise missile to 5 European countries. Richard was then promoted in 1984 to Vice Commander and then Commander of the 487th Tactical Missile Wing at Comiso Air Station in Sicily, where he was responsible for the operational readiness of that missile wing and the welfare of his troops. Now, Cold War history is disappearing, but a simple monthly donation will help keep this podcast on the air. You'll be part of our community, you'll get a sought-after Cold War Conversations coaster as a thank you, and you'll bask in the warm glow of knowing that you're helping to preserve Cold War history.
This is Mary O'Grady. Anyone who's interested in Cold War history should definitely subscribe and support Cold War Conversations. Thank you.
If a monthly contribution is not your cup of tea, we also welcome one-off donations via coldwarconversations.com/donate. I'm delighted to welcome Richard Stachurski to our Cold War conversation.
By the time I left NASA, it was becoming evident that the program might be winding down. And by that time, NASA had upgraded its manning to the point where the need for Air Force officers was not so acute. So the Air Force, wanted their people back. And so I was transferred to another assignment.
And what was that other assignment?
I was assigned to the Drone Remotely Piloted Vehicle Systems Program Office at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. And one other point relative to the NASA thing that is pertinent. While I was there in Houston, I found out they spoke a different language. And it wasn't just howdy and good morning, y'all. It was like sine and cosine and a variation of X with respect to Y. They spoke mathematics, and I didn't. So I decided to go back to school and study mathematics, and I started into that while I was there. And there was a NASA civilian network controller by the name of Dave Young, who just was an enormous help. He tutored me, and sometimes he even went to class with me to make sure he understood what they were trying to impart. And so he was one of the people, again, who helped me along the way, and for which I'm always very grateful. But as I said, I was transferred to the Drone Remotely Piloted Vehicle Systems Program Office, and they were responsible for developing these new systems, which at that stage were in their very, infantile stage.
I guess little did you know how important this program was going to be in the future.
No, we did not.
What was the rationale behind developing this program? Were they worried about the attrition of pilots on missions and trying to find a way of doing some of this work remotely in an automated way?
That was the primary consideration, preserving the lives of aircrew members, and being able to take greater risks. But also, there was an opportunity to relieve crews of what were sometimes very tedious surveillance roles, just plowing through the sky hour after hour in great circles, trying to collect intelligence information. So the collection of intelligence was one of the primary objectives. It was the primary objective of the program I worked on.
Right. So it was being developed more as a reconnaissance tool rather than as an offensive tool.
In the case, the program I worked on was called Compass Cope. And it was kind of fun in a way because it was, as you said, these were early stages of these developments. And so I was a fuzzy-headed captain, and they gave me $20 million, and they said, here's a one-sentence statement of work. Carry 1,500 pounds of payload above 55,000 feet for 24 hours without refueling. Go see if you can do that. And here I am. I have no background in aeronautics, none whatsoever. I was very, very fortunate because they assigned a civilian engineer to me. It's, a civil service person. And his name was Orrin Brenning. He was an aeronautical engineer. And he coached me through this whole thing. He was just enormously helpful. Another one of those people who helped me along the way. And we did it. We had two contractors, Boeing and Teledyne Ryan. We built and tested airplanes. Two of them, each contractor built two airplanes. Boeing lost one in an accident. But Teledyne Ryan flew above 55,000 feet for 28 hours without refueling, which was a world record. So we had a successful program.
So the two contractors were competing for the contract?
Yes.
Was that difficult to manage that or not?
No, there wasn't any particular difficulty. We had to be careful not to, give proprietary information from one contractor to another. And, but other than that, they were pretty civil and, went about the business of trying to get the job done.
Why was the specification for such a high altitude? Was it to avoid anti-aircraft missiles?
That was the primary purpose, and to increase the surveillance area.
What interesting stories have you got from this period, Richard?
I guess the thing that was kind of unique was, being a ground pounder, as they called it, not an aircrew member. I didn't have a sense of how the rest of the Air Force felt about these programs. And so after we lost an aircraft in a takeoff accident, and I had to go to headquarters and explain what had happened. And I was briefing a general who was known for being somewhat caustic. And it was clear that he just didn't understand why anybody would want to replace his pilots with this junk. I mean, he was pretty hostile to the whole idea. And it came through to me for the first time that there was a lot of that environment out there.
What was the earliest period that drones were used operationally?
I honestly don't know because we, as I said, were doing the high altitude work, but there were, normal operating altitudes where the drones were in action, well before we did our work.
So this was one branch of the drone program for a sort of like reconnaissance version. And there was another branch, presumably working on an offensive version.
Yeah, they were tactical, yeah.
So this is 1975. So the Vietnam War's been winding down. And then you're off to the Pentagon for a while.
Yes.
So what was the role you had there?
I worked in the office in XP in plans that was charged with advocating for the drone programs. So what we did was try and get budget allocations for the developments, get blessings for compatible schedules, represent the programs in essentially every facet and try and defend them there so that they could move forward. So we were doing the staff work on budgets and schedules and what have you to try and advance these programs.
Any incidents there? Any personal stories?
Well, it was a valuable tour in the sense that I learned something about the workings of the Air Force bureaucracy. But the story that stands out the most relative to all of that bureaucratic business was one day I had to deliver these papers to a colonel who was the chief of staff of one of the senior officers in our chain of command there. And I had paperclipped the material together, and I handed it to him, and I got a 3-minute lecture on the use of paperclips. He said, "You have the long side of the paperclip on the front side of these papers. They weren't designed that way. They were designed so that the short side would be to the front so that you could easily access and detach the papers." And he went on and on about it. And I said, talk about your bureaucracy.
Must have been a military secret that you hadn't been told about the position of the paper clips.
I apparently wasn't cleared.
Absolutely. But, I mean, following your time at the Pentagon, you are involved in a key program towards the end of the Cold War with a unique new weapon system.
Part of that assignment goes back to, as I told you, when I was in Houston, I started studying for a mathematics degree. And when I was in Ohio at the drone RPV SPO, I finished my degree there at Wright State University, which had a really good math department. And once I had done that, then I was qualified under Air Force ground rules to continue working in research and development programs, which I did then for a very long period of time. And so when I finished at the Pentagon, they were building up the Ground Launch Cruise Missile Program Office, which was part of the Joint Cruise Missile Project Office, which was a joint Navy Air Force operation headed by a Navy admiral named Walter Locke. And our job was to take the existing Navy Sea Launch Cruise Missile and convert it for ground use.
So this involves the design and manufacture of the missile launcher itself and also the control center for it.
Yes. Yeah, those were the main items. And then the logistical support system to support it and the design of the facilities that would support it.
Why was the Navy's platform chosen? Because the Pershing missiles were already being used from a ground launch role. Why was there the need for the cruise nuclear missile system?
Well, the Pershing was a ballistic missile, and so went to a relatively high altitude during its attack profile. The cruise missiles were designed to be under the radar. We used a navigation system called TERCOM, Terrain Contour Matching. And using that system, they flew at 50 feet, and they could go 1,200 miles and hit a target within 30 meters, while sneaking under the enemy's defenses. I can remember we were testing a missile. In fact, it was the first test from a ground launcher at Dugway Proving Ground in Utah. And we watched the test launch, and then we were walking along the dry lake bed, and the missile was flying in a loop, and it came over us, and you couldn't hear a thing until it passed by you, and it was literally at 50 feet.
Wow, and incredible accuracy as well.
Yes, very much so. And the advantage with the Navy's missiles, and all the basic development work had been done.
So it's just finding a way of getting it launch from the ground and the vehicle to carry it and the support structure around it.
Exactly.
As far as the specification and requirements, that was really it, because there was already this pre-existing system, so it was finding a way of launching it effectively from the ground.
And maintaining the performance that was included in the specification.
What were the main challenges that you had sort of facilitating that conversion?
I have to say that was relatively straightforward. Our primary contract was General Dynamics in San Diego. They did a good job.
They were given the specification and they delivered on it.
Yes.
You're there for 3 years developing that, and then you don't escape the cruise missile program, do you? You move on to another role within it.
Yeah, and again, that's a bit of a strange story. After 3 years at the Ground Launch Cruise Missile Program Office, I was due to go to the senior military school, the Air War College, and I was kind of, oriented toward that goal. And I got a phone call from personnel, and they said, General Nichols at the Pentagon is going to Germany, and one of the things he's going to oversee is the GLCM deployment, and he wants you to go with him. And I said, who the heck is General Nichols? I had never heard of the guy, but he apparently had heard of me, and he wanted me to go. And at that time, if you were a colonel, you had to volunteer for an overseas assignment like that. So I had a bit of a negotiation with the personnel people. I said, well, I'm supposed to go to the Air War College, and, that's important to advancing my career and whatever. And they said, go ahead and fulfill General Nichols' request, and we'll send you to whatever air college you want to go to. And I said to myself, well, I'll talk them out of that one. I said, I want to go to the Royal College of Defence Studies in London. And they said, okay, done. And so I had signed up to go to Germany.
But you knew that you'd got a trip to London as well in there.
Yes.
What was your role with General Nichols in Germany?
We were at the headquarters of the United States Air Force in Europe at Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany. And General Nichols was XP. He was the chief of plans. And one of the things he was responsible for in that role was the deployment of this new GLCM system. And so they created a group called XPG. That's the role he wanted me to play, was to head that group to oversee the deployment of these systems to these European countries.
Which countries was this going to be deployed to?
It was going to be Germany, England, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Italy.
Were you having to negotiate the agreements with the host country?
No, not directly. The agreement negotiation, as it was appropriate, was the role of the embassy in that country. But what we did was support those negotiations with whatever technical information they needed relative to, base requirements, system characteristics, all those sorts of things.
This required quite a significant construction program in each of those countries as well.
Yes, it did. We had to construct bunkers to store the missile launchers in. We had to construct weapons storage areas. We had to construct living and support facilities for our troops. A really good example was Comiso Air Station in Sicily. It was a former German World War II fighter base that had been bombed into oblivion. We had to essentially start from scratch and literally spent hundreds of millions of dollars building all of the facilities you need for support and operations. And we had, a lot of cooperation, particularly there from the Navy with the construction and from the Italian Genedife, the Italian engineering branch. It was not atypical. There was a lot to be done at all of these bases.
Yeah, were some more challenging than others in terms of the construction then?
Not so much in terms of the construction. I think the most challenging one in terms of the deployment itself was the Netherlands. They seemed to be somewhat reluctant to expand their role in NATO to include deploying these nuclear weapons. And so the negotiations and the planning for deployment went kind of slowly there. There were other issues too. The Italians, for example, wanted to control the nuclear weapons that would be deployed with the missiles. And we, of course, weren't going to have that happen. And so we said, okay, you can't control them, but you can provide part of the security force, to oversee them. And they finally agreed to that. And so the arrangement was that a company of Carabinieri, the Italian paramilitary police, would be assigned to the base to help guard the weapons storage area. And so when I was there at Comiso as a commander, I was the only American in Italy who commanded Italian troops, interestingly enough.
Yeah. Well, we'll come on to your role at Comiso in a moment. I mean, the Dutch had quite a large anti-nuclear movement, so I guess they were keeping an eye on their next general election as well.
Yeah, that's true. And in Britain as well, there was significant opposition at Greenham Common. Demonstrations got a lot of press, almost worldwide. Our job basically was to let the host countries deal with those demonstrations and protests, and not to be seen as imposing anything on the local population that denied their rights. We had to be pretty diplomatic about it.
Can you tell me how these ground-launched cruise missiles were deployed in the host countries?
Systems were deployed in flights. It consisted of 4 launchers with 4 missiles each and a launch control center. When the flag went up, they deployed from the main base to remote off-site locations, anywhere they could find in the woods where they could hide. And these were just really, really highly classified locations, obviously. The idea was to disperse them, so to make them less vulnerable to attack.
They'd already chosen these locations, so they knew where they were going to go, but I guess they had security units with them as well.
Yeah, the typical flight consisted of the launchers, the launch control center, maintenance personnel, the launch control team, flight commander, and an assigned security force. And the security force in these cases was fairly significant because they would go into the woods somewhere, put up camouflage netting and what have you. But then it was the job of the security police to keep the site secure.
Because I guess the fear was something like Spetsnaz trying to get them or something else like that?
That was the primary fear, yes, the Russian special forces. So when I was there at Comiso, that was a primary consideration. And we used to deploy for training to an Italian site called Vizzini. And the flights would go out there and set up. And we would test them by deploying aggressor forces. It was kind of fun, but sometimes I would go with the aggressors in the middle of the night and crawl through the weeds and listen to the rats scurrying around you and try and penetrate the perimeters, which I did one night. Got myself under a launcher and blew it up. Yeah, they were dependent on the security forces, and they were really, important to accomplishing the role. I used to sometimes go out and essentially assign myself to the security force. I would, man a guard post under the supervision of an NCO or whoever was responsible for that area, so I could get an idea of what they were doing and how they were doing it and what help they might need. I remember one time I was out there and and there was what they called Condition Bravo, where you had to go on an additional alert. And so I was sleeping in a tent with this staff sergeant, and he said, "Okay, you got the first watch." And so off I went, sitting there with my back against a tree with my weapon, trying to fend off any intruders.
Must have taken you back to the early 1960s.
Yeah, at Bunker Hill, yeah.
During that period when you were, at Ramstein and working on that, were there any other incidents that stand out for you?
First one was the bomb. The headquarters building was a C-shaped building with a parking lot just there in front between the two wings of the building. And terrorists had somehow managed to get a vehicle on base. I think it was a Volkswagen minibus, with a propane tank on board that was rigged to explode. And it did, and caused some significant damage. My family and I were living in an apartment there on base at the time. And I was in the morning getting ready to go to work in the bathroom shaving, and I heard this loud boom, and I didn't know what it was. So I got myself ready and went over, and sure enough, the bomb had exploded, and it had wounded two of my people and done a significant amount of damage to the building. And fortunately, no one was killed.
So this was the Red Army faction, the Baader-Meinhof group?
Yes. I believe it was, yes. But beyond that, the incidents were a whole lot more whimsical. In the Netherlands in particular, I was told one time that I had a special appointment with the Minister of Defense. And I said, "Oh, man, this is a big deal." And so I was used to the Pentagon, where defense officials were ensconced in nice office complexes in a huge building. So I showed up at the address where I was supposed to go for this meeting, and there was just a row of townhouses. And I said, "This can't be right." But I checked the number, and sure enough, there it was. And that's where the defense minister was, in a little office with bookshelves behind him. So that was interesting.
Different style of government in Europe sometimes.
Very much so. The other thing relative to the Netherlands was I was there on one mission or another one time, and I was staying in a hotel there in The Hague. And I got a call from an officer in Heidelberg that the SACEUR wanted to see me, General Rogers, the Supreme Allied Commander for Europe. And I said, "Oh, okay, I'll get there as soon as I can. I'll book an airplane ticket." He said, No, don't worry. We're sending an airplane for you. And I said, "Okay." And sure enough, they sent a little single-engine aircraft. We used to call it a Blue Canoe. It was a really nice little airplane, comfortable, etc. And they flew me down there, and I was escorted into the general's office, and he motioned me to sit down, and I did that. And he looked up, and he said to me, "Colonel, do not screw up the Netherlands deployment." And I said, "Yes, sir, understood." And then I was waiting to hear the rest of it, and he said, "Dismissed." That was it. He just wanted to make his point.
And he couldn't do that with a phone call or anything.
Yeah. No, he wanted to be a little more dramatic about it.
Yeah, I mean, you get called into that sort of meeting, you're going to be nervy, I guess, as to what's going to happen.
Yeah, to say that the most senior officer in all of Europe.
Just going back to the protest movements, you were talking about the security of these bases. What were the orders in terms of if a peace protester got into, the Gamma sites, one of the bunkers where the weapons were stored?
Wherever we could, we would depend on local law enforcement outside the base to keep, incidents from happening. If there was a penetration of the base when there were weapons in storage, then we would have to take action by, apprehending the people and treating them appropriately after that. But in Italy, as I said, we had both American and Italians guarding the weapons storage area.
You know, I've spoken to security personnel who worked at Upper Heyford there, and they're pretty clear that if somebody crossed certain fences, then they did have the authority to use lethal force.
Yes, that's true. You know, until they crossed the fence, we tried to use every means we could not to have a confrontation.
At the end of your tour with General Nicholl, do they stick with their agreement for you for your time at the Royal College of Defence Studies?
Yes. And before we leave General Nicholl's, I have to say again, you know, people helped me along through my whole career, and he was one of them. He was just a really, really neat guy. We'd fly somewhere, you know, and if it was a long trip, we'd have to stop and refuel. And he would climb out of the airplane and talk to the refueling crew. He'd say, "I'm Dave Nichols. Thanks for what you're doing. And, you know, how do you do that?" And, you know, he was just that kind of guy. One day I was in my office and he called me and he said, "I want to talk to you about some plans for a ceremony for opening the base at Greenham Common." And he said, "We ought to have this." And I said, "Yes, sir." "And we ought to have that." I said, "Yes, sir." Down his list. And finally he said, "That's one too many yes, sirs. Get your butt down here."
I always consider that a sign of great leadership if you're not in your ivory tower.
Before I got ready to leave, he called me in the office one day, you know, to kind of say goodbye. And he said, "I'm going to be your rabbi." What he meant by that was that he was going to support me to try and advance me through the rest of my career, which I was very grateful.
It's a great story of your career and just people wanting to support you and help you right back to the time of the Buick and driving to Chicago.
Yes, absolutely. That's a major part of the story.
So what's student life like at the Royal College of Defence Studies in London? Is it like normal student life, lots of time in bars and not attending many studies? I'm sure it's not, but tell me.
It was really tough duty, but somebody had to do it, you know. And we had an apartment in West 11, a block north of Hyde Park and about 2 blocks west of Portobello Road. I can remember waking up one morning and hearing this clattering in the street, and I couldn't imagine what it was. So I looked out the street, and it was the Royal Horse Guards out for some sort of training exercise. And I could take the bus to school every day, and the day's work would consist of about 4 or 5 hours of guest lectures delivered by experts from, you know, one place or another. And the focus of the course was international relations. And so that's how we spent our time. There was no real studying or anything like that. We just listened, and then afterwards discussed what we'd heard and exchange views. And it was interesting because, you know, there were like 75 students from about 28 different countries, and many of them the countries were former British colonies. So there were a lot of interesting exchanges. It was pretty nice, and it also involved overseas. You know, well, trips of one sort or another. We spent some time in Scotland, but then we could pick destinations for overseas tours. And so I ended up going to Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, a group of us. And that, as you can expect, was really different.
Tell me about your role as Vice Commander and later Commando of Comiso Air Base in Sicily.
Well, the primary task was to ensure the mission readiness of the unit. But the obvious and important secondary role was seen in the morale and welfare of the people. And that was a particular consideration here because all of the people were on unaccompanied tours. No family, no dependents allowed. In fact, the vice commander and I were the only ones allowed to have our families there. And that's because it was thought that the wives would be helpful in establishing diplomatic relations with the local community. But other than that, they were all away from their families for a year.
Wow. And how many troops was that were there with you?
About 1,700.
And how many missiles were under your command?
There were 112.
Because I think you mentioned to me when we were preparing for this call, this made you quite a significant nuclear power.
Yes, I was. Yeah, we had 7 flights, 16 missiles each. It was really interesting. I had to sign for the warheads, and I signed for them using a supply hand receipt, a little 5x8 sheet of paper. If you went to supply to borrow a tool for some job or whatever, they would give you the tool, but you had to sign a hand receipt. Well, that's what I did for all those nuclear weapons, was this little single sheet of paper. I said, wow.
Should have got that framed. That would have been a great memento.
Yes.
But I think what you told me is it made you something like the 4th largest nuclear power.
I think so, yeah. I don't remember the exact calculation, but it was significant.
Yeah, and what were the challenges of the role?
That's a good question. I think that the basic challenge was maintaining the morale and support of all these troops who were on these unaccompanied tours. And I saw that as a significant challenge. It turned out to be not as much of a challenge as I thought because they were really well motivated for the most part. And, really good people.
I mean, you mentioned the bomb attack at Ramstein, but in Italy, you've obviously got another terrorist issue with the Red Brigades. Did you have to take any extra precautions around that?
Yes, we did. For example, when we first started, we had no facilities on base for our troops, or very limited facilities. And so they lived in local hotels for the most part and traveled back and forth to the base each day by bus. So what we did was we arranged so that we could change the route and the time of the bus schedules every day to make sure no one could set up an IED or an ambush or whatever. So that was one of the measures we took. Because they had already kidnapped a senior Army officer, there was particular concern about our senior officers. So I had a bodyguard that was with me all day, and at night we had 2 sentries. It was kind of interesting. My wife and I lived in a little flimsy porta cabin on the side of a construction site. And so we had guards at night, and when they would talk to each other, we could hear them. So we had to sometimes call the command post and say, would you tell those guys to shut up?
I would have imagined something a little bit more palatial for somebody of your rank, Richard.
No, it was a flimsy little porta cabin because there had been no base housing built yet.
So once the base is built and you've received the missiles, what sort of exercises are you doing and how regular are they?
The main exercises were deployment exercises. And as I said, we would use this Italian site at a place called Vizzini. And a flight would be, put on alert, then told to execute. And they would then deploy to the dispersal site, set up, standby, and, we would look at how ready they were when they did that and how secure they kept things. That was the main form of training, were these deployment exercises. Although sometimes you could also exercise launching from the base, which was possible because the launchers were stored in very large bunkers, and you could just pull them out and launch.
You were saying there you could launch from the base or they could be deployed from the base, but I guess, the deployment would have to be sort of scheduled in one way, or could there just be, right, the alarm goes and you're out the gate within, 10 minutes or something?
Yeah, it was that sort of thing. When we received the orders, then we would deploy.
And how friendly were the locals with, the thought of having this, nuclear missile base in their midst?
We had some minor protest activity, but for the most part, they were friendly and receptive. The people of Comiso and the surrounding towns like Caltagirone. And we did all we could to augment those relationships. I think of one instance in particular where Comiso, outside of the city, had a garbage disposal site, and it caught fire. And it was a fire deep within the site, and they couldn't put it out. And my fire chief on base came to me and he said, "Sir, I think I can deal with that." He said, "We have foam that we use for aircraft fires that I think will penetrate and do that job." So I said, "Let's talk to the locals," and they were happy to agree, and we put out the fire. We would, take opportunities wherever we could to augment it, and they were generally frequently receptive, and we would have fairly frequent gatherings on base where we would invite the local citizenry. 4th of July was one time in particular where we would have some sort of activity on base and invite the locals. I remember 4th of July, when I was there were a couple of incidents there that were kind of amusing. When the people were arriving, that was a New Year's event we staged and invited, senior local citizens to. And as people arrived, I was telling them, "Buon anno," which I thought meant Happy New Year. And the guy who was my translator called me aside and he said, "You've been telling them nice ass." Anno is ass. Year is anno. You pronounce each letter in Italian. I said, "Whoops." But I finally I remedied that. I studied Italian because, as I said, I commanded Italian troops. And I thought I had an obligation to be able to speak to them when out at night, went out at midnight to check guard posts in the storage area, that I could communicate with the guys on duty. Mm. So I enjoyed, I had a tutor. I sent myself to a total immersion school in Milan for a couple of weeks. That was kind of interesting. I was a little reluctant to do that. So I talked to the NATO commander up there in Venice. I said, "Do you think it's okay if I take the funds to send myself to the school?" And he looked at me and he said, "What are they going to do, make you a colonel and send you to Sicily?" And I said, "Okay, I got the idea." So I learned to speak passable Italian. Again, going back to the 4th of July celebration, when everybody had assembled, much to nobody's expectation, I gave my speech in Italian. And my translator, who translated normally from Italian to English for me, translated from Italian to English for the Americans in the audience. And the locals were quite pleased with all of that. And I enjoyed learning the local language.
I think it always goes a long way wherever you are. If you make an effort to speak in the language, they really appreciate that, because it shows that you're interested and care about them.
Yes. I remember that 4th of July event, as people were leaving, one of the attendees had been the bishop of the local diocese. So I thought, well, I'll escort him to the gate. And I did that. And when we got there, he said, before I leave, I want to thank you. And I said, having this party and sharing with you was just fun. He said, no, that's not what I'm talking about. And I said, oh. And he said, freedom and liberty. You all started that back there in 1776 and spread it around the world. And we're all grateful for that. I said, wow.
Yeah. Yeah, no, powerful stuff. I'd argue that, you started it in 1776. I think our parliament was probably around a bit before then, but I'm not going to cross swords with you, Richard.
You don't want to cross swords with the bishop.
No, exactly. Or cross mitres, for that matter. Did you ever think that the Soviets would attack at some point? Or did you thought that deterrence was going to prevail?
I think I thought it would prevail, and I thought that we were doing our part in making sure that deterrence was effective.
The cruise missile program didn't really last that long, did it? Because with the INF treaty, they were then withdrawn. So it's a very expensive construction program that really didn't, last for very long at all.
Yeah, and the construction process could be really interesting some days. We were, as I said, we lived in this little porta cabin, and one day we were indoors, and as I said, it was right next to where they were doing construction, and we were, I don't know what we were doing, but we heard this loud clanging noise, and so I didn't know what that was, so I got on my brick, which is what they called the little radio I carried, and I called the command post, and I found out that a backhoe operator, as he was digging, had struck an unexploded bomb, a British 100-kilogram bomb. You guys made bombs that didn't work, apparently. And so it was then kind of interesting to watch the Italian contractor. They had a pretty primitive explosive ordnance disposal team. They climbed down there with a hammer and chisel and broke the fuse off and then hauled it away. And later that afternoon, we heard them detonate it somewhere to the west of the base.
Wow. I was going to say, to be fair, there's a lot of unexploded German ordnance still lying around in the UK. So it wasn't just us.
No, it was everybody.
Yeah. So, Richard, in all of this story, there's an unsung hero, your wife.
Yes, there is. Along the way, I've tried to highlight those people who helped me and supported me, during the course of my career. But there's one person in particular, as you just mentioned, my wife, Mary Lou, who has been my principal supporter through 26 years. She started out in a dilapidated apartment in a little town in Indiana, and 26 years later ended up in a flimsy porta cabin on the edge of a bombed-out fighter base in Sicily. Along the way, she was subject to constant movement and turmoil. During one 9-year period, we moved 11 times. And every time she would immediately take hold, establish a comfortable, supportive household, and then stand by to support me as I tried to learn the ins and outs of whatever new assignment that I was working on. She has really been my principal supporters, in addition to the many others that I've had.
Everywhere you moved to, she gave you a sort of solid operating base to work from.
That's a good description, yes. And along the way, she raised 2 fine children. When you think about it, pick her up, plunk her down in Germany or Italy or Texas, and she knows no one. She has no network. She's all alone with children to raise and a household to establish, and she does a great job every single time.
Yeah, yeah. What you've, described to me over the last 2 hours or so is it's an incredible career and an incredible story, of you being supported almost every step of the way by, various officers and people you meet. But when you look back over that career, what would you say is your proudest moment?
First of all, part of it is what you said. I'm grateful for all the people who helped me along the way. In terms of moments that I remember most or were most significant to me, one of them, of course, was Apollo 11. And I guess the other that I remember well is receiving a group award of the Presidential Medal of Freedom for Apollo 13. So my tour at NASA was probably the highlight, although all the rest of them were, terribly interesting, adventurous.
I can understand you picking that one because it was an incredible effort to carry off that mission, from Kennedy saying we're going to go for the moon in the early 60s to delivering it before the end of that decade.
Yes.
And yes. You were part of that. There was a whole other teams of people there, but it all had to come together more or less perfectly in order for it to work and to ensure the safety of those 3 astronauts.
Yeah, and along the way, it sometimes took some improvisation to get it done.
Don't miss the episode extras such as videos, photos and other content. Just look for the link in the podcast information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous support of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. If you'd like to help the project, just go to coldwarconversations.com/donate. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and see you next week. Thanks for listening right through to the end. I really appreciate it. And maybe check out our store and see if you can find the ideal gift for the Cold War enthusiast in your life. Just go to coldwarconversations.com/store. Thanks for listening.